Welcome back, everybody. Part 2 of the Civil War unit revolves around slavery. After all, if the nation is struggling to stay together because of the institution of slavery, we should dive into why slavery is the issue and what slavery looks like come 1860. Let's dive into some vocabulary that we need for this unit. The Confederacy, also known as the Confederate States of America, this is made up of those states that seceded from the Union starting in 1860. Border states are states that are right along the border of the South and the Union or the North, and they remain loyal to the Union despite the fact that they are slave states. The Underground Railroad is a system that is used by abolitionists to free escaped slaves or to route escaped slaves to areas of hopefully safety. Okay, Harriet Tubman is the probably the most recognized or familiar Underground Railroad. One, escaped slave, and then two, someone that helps many slaves escape. Let's dive into the development of slavery as it pertains to the United States. And the first important date, we're going all the way back. The first important date is 1619, and this is the date of the arrival of the first African slaves in the colony of Virginia. Very important date. A little bit later, 1676, you get Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon was formerly an indentured servant. An indentured servant or indentured servitude is kind of a pseudo form of slavery, but indentured servants did have the opportunity to gain their freedom under the assumption that they lived through their contract. Nathaniel Bacon was one such individual, but the white elite class he did not like. He did not approve of his lot in life after his indentured servitude, and he really goes to Jamestown and raises hell, if you will. It is at this time the white elite class really decides that they need to stop using indentured servitude and really focus on using Africans for slaves. Jumping ahead, 1793, the cotton gin is invented. Up until this point, cotton as a cash crop is not grown by many. It's a very labor-intensive crop. There hasn't been a good way to pick cotton, and it's just not worth the while of the planters or plantation owners to grow this crop as opposed to a different crop such as tobacco, one of the first cash crop established by colonists in the 1600s. However, the cotton gin is invented and makes picking cotton easier. However, it does not get rid of the labor that is required to pick cotton. So the cotton gin makes it more worthwhile to pick or grow cotton, rather, but it does not make it, it does not reduce the number of slaves that planters need. In fact, it increases the amount of labor or slaves that are needed to pick cotton. And therefore, we will see this, the rise of cotton and the rise of slavery, only more so post 1793. Couple of important dates in 1804. Slavery in the northern states is banned in 1804. They're either in the process of it or have already banned it. I'm talking about individual states at that time. In 1804, the Haitian Revolution ends. Haitian, if you see that, Haiti. Okay, so there was a slave insurrection, and ultimately the slaves, in a very, putting this very broadly, the slaves win the revolution. Okay, they topple the power, the established power, overthrow overthrow the established power, and sure enough, they take control of the country. This drives so much fear into slave owners in the United States, and slave owners work hard to stop their slaves from getting an education. They drive more fear and are more oppressive to slaves because they fear something like the Haitian Revolution happening in the United States. The slave trade in 1808 is banned, and what's important to note about this is what we're discussing by the slave trade here is the slave trade as it pertains to trading between countries no longer is okay or no longer legal. It still happens, but technically slaves cannot be imported into the United States. Slaves can very much be traded within states, but slaves cannot be bought from outside of the United States. Continuing on, there have been a number of revolts or rebellions by slaves. One of the more famous ones happens in 1831. This continues to drive fear into planters and the white elite in the South. Nat Turner's rebellion, he was a preacher, and he is someone that leads a rebellion. The result of it is not good for those rebelling, and it leads to stricter slave laws and stricter, more violent abuse by planters. In the same year, 1831, William Lloyd Garrison, an abolitionist, creates the abolitionist paper. We're starting to see the growth of abolitionism. The British outlaw slavery in 1833. So much, a lot of nations are, not a lot, some nations are moving in the direction of banning slavery. However, the U.S. and the South is working really hard to maintain their established institution of slavery. They are reliant on it from an economic perspective. They feel so to get rid of it would cause a major upheaval and problems in that part of, in their region. Finally, as we look from 1800 to 1860, just approximately those dates, King Cotton. Yes, we already mentioned this. Cotton and the use of it is growing, and it is helping a number of planters become rich, and the demand for cotton is quite high. And the point of this is, as cotton and its demand grows, then the slave labor also grows with it. Also, in this larger time period, 1800 to 1860, the Underground Railroad begins or is created. Keep in mind, the Underground Railroad, it's not a railroad of any sort. It's not a railroad as in the physical sense. It's a system of moving escaped slaves to safe places. That means slaves are headed from the South to the North and even Canada. All right, what I let you silently watch a moment is this map, and you see the growth from really the establishment of the United States, you see the growth of free states and slave states. The kind of brightest blue are the free states, and that reddish pink, if you will, the bolder one, are the slave states. And you see by 1860 right here, 1861, really you see the South and those slave states that have been established, and then the North in blue. But keep in mind, again, this is 1789 to 1861. So you see the growth of slave and free states, and then the movement west of the United States and territories being created. Wisconsin Territory right there. Then all of a sudden in 1848, that became a state. So as the United States has grown and has many more states, we know it is on its way to growing only larger because of the territories that are created. What do the numbers say about slavery? What do they say about slavery? So let's dive into that. What do we see when it comes to slave holding? Okay, so who and where, what does this image have to do with? When does it have to do with? When are we looking at this map and then graph rather? And then what is it telling us? So who and where, if you haven't guessed it by now or determined it by now, we're looking at Southern whites, kind of there in the title. That's where you could have seen that. Additionally, when, same type of thing, by 1860. Ultimately, though, what is this telling us? What it tells us is that when you look at whites in regard to slave ownership, the majority, large majority of the white population in the South does not have any slaves. You see some with 1 to 9 slaves, but by the time you get done with those two groups, you see a large percentage of the United States population already made up, over 90%. That means there is approximately 7% of the white population left. And this 7% of the white population has or owns most of the slaves. This is the elite planter class. They are the ones with social and political and economic power. Meanwhile, very specifically, the non-slave holders, this is a very poor white class, very illiterate. They do not know how to read. They do not know how to write, and they are just working, farming to survive. They are not farming cash crops. They are farming for survival. Continuing on, let's look at this graph, give it a quick study. We'll work our way to the what, but for starters, when it comes to this graph, who and where does this graph address? If we take a look at it, cotton farming in the United States. So in the United States, and when we're talking United States and cotton, we're really looking in the southern part of the United States. So again, we're looking at these southern states. We're looking at slave states. When is this happening? Well, it's over a period of time. You probably noticed that pretty quick, 1800 to 1860. You see it in the graph there, at the bottom of the graph, and on the x-axis, 1800, 1820, 40, and 1860. And then what is this telling us? Okay, so shortly after the cotton gin, 1800, keep in mind 1800 is on the graph, but 1793, 94 is that cotton gin invention. Shortly after the introduction of the cotton gin, little cotton is exported. So United States, this graph is telling us how much cotton is sold outwardly to other countries. So it's only 7% of cotton exports. It's only 7%. Let me try that again. Cotton exports are only 7% of all U.S. exports, all goods being traded to other countries. That's a small percentage, not even 10%. Meanwhile, as we start to move forward through the decades, you see by 1820, there's a lot of growth. There's still a lot of growth. And by the time you get to 1860, there's not a lot of growth from 1840 to 1860. But if you look at where we began, the United States began in 1800 on this graph, well, that's a huge amount of growth. And if you look at the percentage, 58% of all exports, all goods sold to other countries by the United States, 58% of it is cotton. Wow, cotton was king leading up to the Civil War. Let's take a look at the conclusions. We just touched on this last one, the growth of cotton. You bet that picked up big time. And keep in mind, the growth of cotton is correlated with the growth of slaves. One thing that we did not discuss in here, but it is worth noting right away because it will be brought up at the end of this unit, abolition versus equality. Keep in mind what abolition or an abolitionist, a person who is who believes in abolition or what they are doing is they are fighting against slavery. They think the institution is wrong and they're trying to overturn that institution. That is specific to slavery, not equality. Oppression. The Haitian Revolution happened and it scared planters in the United States. So what did they do? How did they react? They became more violent in their ways. They worked harder to oppress slaves in their possession. And this was something that was not done by planter A or planter B, but this is seen throughout the South. Education, to make note of it, it was mentioned, but make note of it again. Education is valued by planters and is seen as a threat, therefore, to the institution of slavery if their slaves had an education. So an educated slave was a very bad thing. So do not let your slaves gain an education or have access to it. That takes us to the end of this particular section regarding our Civil War review, and it takes us right up to 1860, where we see the election of Abraham Lincoln. Next time, we're moving into the Civil War, specifically as it pertains to Reconstruction. See you next time.